Ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to welcome you to the first NEO EPL mini course of this year. NEO is the Northwestern Emeriti organization. EPL is Evanston Public Library, and this is a collaboration that is entering its 5th year. This is the 16th mini course that we've done. We are really very pleased at the response that we've been getting through these years, and that it's an exciting program every time. My name is Jeff Garrett. I'm welcoming you on behalf of Heather Norborg, who is the interim director of the library and who is as pleased as I am that this program has been such a success. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce Mikhail Ginsberg, who is a member of NEO and also the Emerita professor of French and Italian. She'll be introducing our speaker.
Good evening, everybody. I would like to thank our speaker for coming to the rescue because, can you hear me? Yeah, because Carl Smith unfortunately came down with COVID at the very last minute, and we appealed to Henry's goodness of heart, and he came to the rescue. Henry Binford is Professor Emeritus of History and Urban Studies. And in his articles and books, he dealt primarily with the question of the suburbs and the expansion of cities into the suburbs. He wrote one book about Boston, one book about Cincinnati. And in all these books, I think one of legendary tours of Chicago. And I read a whole account of it by a person who was fortunate enough to participate in one of those tours. And these tours showed both his deep knowledge of the city and his acumen as an urban observer. And today he will share with us this knowledge of 19th century Chicago. Please join me with welcoming him. Henry? I'm supposed to give the microphone.
Can you all hear me in the back there? I'm Henry Binford, and I'm guilty of all the things I was just accused of. I apologize for being a poor substitute for Carl Smith, whom I know you all came to see. But in some ways, what you're getting is the other half of a team. Carl and I are good friends and have been since the 1970s. We have also team taught courses on many occasions, including a number of courses about Chicago. He generously shared with me some of the materials he had prepared for tonight. So I kind of know where he was going, but I've thrown in a few things of my own as well. I'm glad to see such an amazing turnout. Thank you all for showing up. And thanks to all of you in TV land out there. That shows how old I am. So this is the first of 2 lectures, and together they cover a tiny fraction of Chicago's history and a tiny fraction of the time span of Chicago's history. And it's I had a hard time preparing these because there's so many things I had to leave out. But you get to ask questions. So if there are things I don't talk about, or if there are things I don't talk about adequately, please ask me toward the end. I'm going to take a little break in the middle partly because of my own health. I talked to Carl today, by the way. I communicated with him, and he is on the mend, much better, but still tired, weak, whatnot. I myself have had COVID, and I'm 6 times vaccinated, but I may sound a little snuffy and when I talk, because I do have what used to be called a common cold. And if I break into a cough every so often, I apologize. So I'm going to divide the lecture into 2 parts, and we'll have a little break in the middle. Part 1 has to do with the ways in which Chicago was, at least in my opinion, a new kind of city in the 19th century, not just a upstart city that sprang up out of nowhere, according to people who witnessed it at the time, but something different in terms of how cities grow. And it was surprising to a lot of people, because this is not a place where you'd expect to find a big city. Big cities over the long course of human history have been put in places where they were either militarily defensible hills, we don't have those here, or junctions of large bodies of water, oceans and major rivers and so forth, like the Hudson River or the Thames or whatever. We have a river, but you know, they were customarily put in places where they would be the center of national bureaucracies, and we've never done that. So there's a big question about how it got here in the first place, in this place where a city should not be. And today I'm going to talk about that, and then I'm going to talk about how it got to be first the 3rd city in the nation, because you got to be 3rd before you can be 2nd. And then the following lecture, I'm going to take up things that are mostly in the 20th century and have to do with some of those issues. I will not be talking about the enormous and rich and long history of indigenous peoples in Chicago. I will not be talking about Mayor Daley, either of the mayors Daley, except maybe at the very end. So we're kind of in the middle here, between those bookends. This is, as I mentioned, a place where you shouldn't find a city. Uh-oh. I'm having trouble already. Okay. Okay. There are a lot of reasons, as I just mentioned. It's not a good location for big city building. It's in a region that was, in the early 19th century, full of impediments. The land is flat. It was prairie, tall grass prairie, which was kind of astonishing to people who first, that is, white people who first came here. And some of them tried to farm the land around here with their traditional implements, which mostly were wooden plows pulled by horses or mules or by themselves. And that won't work with the tall grass prairie, because it has roots that go down 10, 12 feet in the ground. So they went someplace which was more familiar. And that someplace was the Ohio Valley and the lower reaches of the Mississippi along Missouri and Illinois. There are a lot of other impediments, which I'll mention as we go along. It's also the case that there are other regions and cities in America that had a head start. So if we look at, this is a little table of population. It is, I should warn you that I have, as Mikhail mentioned, I recently published a book about Cincinnati. So I have Cincinnati on the brain. And it may come up more than you want this evening, but this table is pruned down from one I made for the book at Cincinnati. But the thing about Cincinnati is that it was until the 1850s the most important city in the American interior. It was by far the biggest of all those interior cities, much bigger than Detroit, Buffalo, St. Louis, Pittsburgh, all those places in the early 19th century. It was also extremely innovative. Has an amazing trade down the Ohio River to the Caribbean and other places. Most of you probably know that it was one of the places where pork packing became mechanized. In fact, most of what used to be done in the stockyards on the south side of Chicago was invented in Cincinnati. It became a magnet for talented young people. So all kinds of people who became important in other realms of life when they were young often spent some time in Cincinnati. It was kind of like what San Francisco or Seattle might be today. If you're young and footloose and you want to be where there are a lot of smart people, that's where you would go. And Cincinnati was economically a powerhouse. So it's kind of surprising that another major city would pop up in this region, and I'll explain why later on. But Chicago became that major city, and it took off like gangbusters in the period after the one I'm going to talk about tonight. I neglected to bring a pointer. Does this thing have a pointer in it? No. It does. Green. Something else I have to turn on?
That's it. That's it.
Okay. Yep. Am I here? Yes. Okay. I want to back up just a little because not that far. This is another way of looking at Chicago's extraordinary population growth, especially in the latter part of the 19th century. Chicago is that red triangle sticking up there. This is a three-dimensional sort of representation of urban growth. It fails in some ways because cities that are on there but behind other cities aren't quite so visible. But it certainly shows how Chicago took off from the 1850s onward. Chicago, from a handful of people, a few hundred when it was first founded, grew to be a city of 100,000 people, which was a major marker in the 19th century. Only a handful of cities were that big. It became a 100,000 plus city before the Civil War. It was 300,000 people by the time of the fire. It was 500,000 people a decade later. And it went past 1 million and eventually more millions in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. No city in the history of the planet had ever grown that big, that fast at the time when Chicago did it. Other cities have done that and surpassed Chicago more recently, but at the time, Chicago was the wonder city in terms of growth. And it is also unusual because I've got a series of maps here that show cities of more than 100,000 people and cities of more than 5,000 people. The red ones are 100,000 and the yellow ones are 5,000. So you can see that in 1820, there's really only one city in the United States, and that's New York, that had more than 100,000 people. By 1850, there are more along the coast. And then there's that red dot right there in the middle. That's Cincinnati. Cincinnati was the first city in the interior heartland to surpass that number. And more yellow little dots, including the one where we are right now. By 1890, we've got a rapidly urbanizing nation, even though a majority of the population still lived in rural areas. And you've got many 100,000 plus cities spread across the landscape. And Chicago, by this time, is well past that marker. All of which is surprising because, as I mentioned, this is not a great place for a city, at least in terms of the way it was when people first started settling here, Euro-American people in large numbers. This is Chicago in 1831, toward the tail end of the Fort Dearborn period. It was a military outpost and occasionally an important one, but really not a very, very good one. There were other United States forts that were much more solidly constructed in better locations. This one served mostly as a garrison to protect fur trading and a variety of other commercial activities. And it's, that's the garrison of the fort plus a few people who were farmers and traders and fur trappers and so forth around that was Chicago in 1831. And I put that date on it because this is right at the beginning of the growth spurt that's going to come later. But in 1831, there were other places that were much more urban, at least by the standards we use. This is Cincinnati in the 1830s on the lower right. It's a going concern. It's got steamboats on the rivers. A third of all the steamboats in use in the 1830s on the Ohio, Mississippi rivers were built in Cincinnati. They made steamboats, they made railway equipment, they made steel. The first machine gun in the world was made in Cincinnati by a man named Gatling. All kinds of stuff going on there. You can see why I've got Cincinnati on the brain. It had gone from a little frontier settlement to being a major city by the 1830s. Other places in the Middle West, Buffalo and St. Louis, also by 1850, when Cincinnati is getting big, very big, Chicago is not so big, we're still farther ahead. So you've got circumstances that aren't favorable. You've got a lot of other places that are trying to be the most important city in the interior of the United States. And meanwhile, this is Chicago. This is it's from a watercolor that was made by a resident of Chicago at the time when it was first incorporated as a town. There have been historians that have tracked all those buildings to figure out who lived there and what they were. And turns out that some number of them were taverns, which makes sense given what there was to do around here. And Cincinnati was, Chicago was the kind of place that was very useful for some people, including our founder, Jean-Baptiste du Sable, who was like a lot of people in this area, who was semi-transient and had very mixed ancestry. He's part African, he's part French, he's probably part some other things. We actually don't know a whole lot about him, and we don't even know what he looked like. So all these representations that you see, including the one outside on the sidewalk, are based on descriptions and not on any kind of real images. But he was a trader. He spent a lot of time off on the trail in the forest and going up and down the river. He was also a farmer, like a bunch of other people who were here, not many people. And then there are people who are what were called Métis, which is a mixture of French and indigenous people. There were a lot of them. The most important one in our area was this lady who is named Wilmette, and she gave her name to a tract of land up here north of where we are now, because she and her family had done important favors for the settlers, the white settlers here, and they rewarded her after the so-called Fort Dearborn massacre with a big chunk of land up there on the North Shore. And that's why it's called Wilmette, but of course we Americanized the name. So, why have we got a city here? That's the question. I'm going to suggest that it has to do with a number of factors. One of them is accidental, the time when it happened to get founded and acquire enough wherewithal, enough capital to start building something. One of them has to do with the national government and what it was willing to do to settle the interior. One of them has to do with technology of all kinds, especially the technology of transportation. And in all those ways, Chicago is very lucky. So what you've got is a place where there shouldn't have been a city, where some bunch of people come with the idea of making a city. And of course, the thing that draws them is the thing that people of European background had known for well over a century, which is that just west of where we are now, there is a continental divide. Continental divide, he says. You think Rockies, you think Alleghenies. We don't have that here, but we do have a ridge of high ground that separates all the little creeks and streams that flow into the Great Lakes and ultimately into the Atlantic Ocean. Am I pointing in the right direction? And all the little rivers and streams that empty the other way west into the Des Plaines River, the Illinois River, the Mississippi, and wind up in the Gulf of Mexico. And the French, when they came through here in the late 17th century, learned about this from indigenous people. They learned that there was a portage up the south branch of the Chicago River, where you could take your canoe out of the water, and sometimes if it were flooded, even keep it in the water, and portage just a short difference and wind up on the Des Plaines River, which flows the other way. So the French correctly recognized this was potentially an enormously valuable place, because you could dig a canal through that continental divide that connected the south branch of the Chicago River with the Des Plaines River. You would connect the whole of the Great Lakes Basin, except at that time Lake Ontario, because there's Niagara Falls, and the whole of the Ohio, Missouri, Mississippi River system on the other side. They knew about that, but knowing about it and doing something about it are two entirely different things. So that dream of the canal is floating there, and it's brings on a lot of speculation, a lot of ideas about how to do it, but timing is important. And the ability to do that came in the early 19th century in things that happened not just to oops, that's the wrong slide. Not just happened to Chicago, but to other places in the interior. The map on the left shows routes frequently used by indigenous people as they travel around what we call the Middle West. They knew about all the portages. They knew about the weather conditions. They knew about how to get from high water to low water and when you could do it and when you couldn't. And there's a great deal of commerce in the Middle West, and including long distance commerce down the Mississippi Valley up into Canada and so forth by indigenous people. Now, it doesn't involve large quantities of goods. It doesn't involve very heavy goods, but it did involve trade value. And the French learned about that too, that there was potential for commerce in this region. So in the early 19th century, when our country became the United States and not a bunch of colonies, one of the things that the federal government was anxious to do was to raise money, because they had fought a war, the Revolutionary War. They had incurred a whole lot of other expenses trying to get the country started, and there wasn't much revenue coming in. No income tax, of course, in those days. So one of the things they were anxious to do is to make use of a resource that they had plenty of, which was land. And they had plenty of it, especially in the Middle West, because of the Northwest Territory and the laws that governed it established in the 1780s. The Northwest Territory included everything west of Pennsylvania and north of the Ohio River up to the Mississippi. So 5 states were eventually created out of the Northwest Territory: Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. In the beginning, it was all federal land. After some negotiations with the states, colonies turned states, some of which had boundaries on their charters from the British Crown that had no Western limits. So there was a lot of negotiation between the federal government and the states, and eventually the feds got control of that huge amount of territory. For some time, it was dubious control because after the Revolution, the British were not anxious to leave. So they still had forts in what's now Ohio and in Michigan and in other places. But after the War of 1812, this is one of the key pieces of timing. It was very clear that the Northwest area was going to be securely part of the United States. And that opened the way for land dealings, for efforts to cultivate trade, and a lot of other things that benefited trying to make a city in this region. And one of the things that it triggered was an explosion in canal building. So on the right-hand map over here, you've got canals that existed in the United States as of 1860. The endpoints are those little dark spots, and you could see there are canals all over the place. Following the opening of the first and in some ways most important, the Erie Canal in 1815. The Erie Canal opened up part of the Midwest, but there's still this Niagara Falls problem. Until eventually they built a canal around Niagara Falls, the Erie Canal wasn't going to do much good except for people in New York and the upper parts of Pennsylvania and Ohio, eastern Ohio. But it started things, and the people who built the Erie Canal, largely New Yorkers, realized that eventually they might be able to make some money out of other things. So investors from New York City principally, but also from Boston and Philadelphia, began prowling around the Northwest Territory, investigating the quality of land, the availability of timber, the possibilities for agriculture, the possibilities for commerce. In other words, you've got potential investors and potential infrastructure builders who are out here in a time period after 1815 when they think something might actually happen. And one of the things they start doing, and not just here, is building more canals. So you can see from this map, I get it to work, yay. Oops, that's not what I want. Well, wrong way. You should have Carl here. Okay. You can see that there are canals that join Lake Erie, a couple of them, down to the Ohio River there. There's the Wabash Canal, which followed the line of the Wabash River and eventually reached the Mississippi. There's a lot of other canals being built all over the northern part of the United States. Canal building is huge engineering work. There weren't many trained engineers in the United States at this time. But the value of those canals was so great that investors would put out huge sums of money, would hire armies of workers to try to make these connections. And indeed, although we here in Chicago like to brag about the Illinois and Michigan Canal as what opened up the Great Lakes in connection with the Mississippi, a couple of these other canals were actually opened first, including one of the ones in Ohio. Although the one we built turned out to be at least as important, if not more important, as that one. And so there's a lot of effort to, after 1815, try to mobilize capital, try to mobilize talent to build more canals all across the North, and eventually the one here. In order to build that, of course, they had to displace the indigenous population, which they had been doing already in significant ways. But in one of a whole series of exploitive treaties in the Northwest Territory, the indigenous people lost a little bit here and a little bit there, and eventually the whole of the southern part of Ohio and then the northern part of Ohio. And in 1816, they negotiated what we would call an easement. So the Native Americans didn't actually give up ownership of the land, but in this swath of land, you can see on the screen, here we go again, between these two diagonal lines, they negotiated an agreement in which the indigenous people agreed to let those people build a canal. Now, they hadn't surveyed a canal. They didn't know where it would go. This is where it eventually went. But at the beginning, they didn't know. Those two parallel lines got to be known as Indian boundary lines. And a lot of you who live around here know that that name lives on. If you drive down Clark Street, Chicago Avenue, Clark Street, into Rogers Park, you will hit Rogers Avenue, which is a diagonal street that's right along there. And if you go out into the suburbs, there are lots of little fragments of road that are called Indian Boundary Road or Indian Boundary Park or that kind of thing. These are mementos of this 1816 agreement, and negotiated one of a whole host of treaties by which the indigenous people were gradually, systematically dispossessed of their land. So you've got the possibility of improved travel with canals. You've got the acquisition of an easement for people here in Illinois. What are you going to do with that? Well, there were people here in Chicago who desperately wanted to build that canal. They had done a few surveys, they had done a few studies, but canal building is expensive. They had no money. What do you do if you don't have money? Well, in a place like this, where you've just taken a lot of land away from the indigenous people, you turn it into property and sell it. And the Illinois canal promoters did that in cooperation with the federal government. So what you've got within these two boundaries is a manifestation of a system devised by Thomas Jefferson principally in the 1780s, when after the federal government secured or created the Northwest Territory, Jefferson realized that all that land had to be surveyed if it was going to acquire value. So he created this Enlightenment dream of a rectangular survey in which the whole of the Northwest Territory was supposed to be surveyed into parcels, 6 miles on a side, squares called townships. Each of those townships contained 36 1 square mile sections, and that would become the basic system of land in the Northwest. And they started this in Ohio, as you can see up here, that eastern corner of Ohio next to Pennsylvania. That became the land known as the 7 Ranges, where they tried out this system, and then they went ka-chunk, ka-chunk, ka-chunk farther across the country. This system actually turned out to be so popular and so useful for land investors and whatnot that eventually most of the Western United States got surveyed using this system. Now imagine that, right? Imagine yourselves out there in the early 19th century creating 6 mile squares according to this sort of network that Jefferson has dreamed up. You won't have aerial photography. You don't have laser transits. You don't have any of the modern conveniences of trying to decide where land boundaries are. What you've got is primitive instruments, especially a thing called a chain, which is very much like what we use to measure first downs in football. You've got 2 poles with a length of chain between them that's carefully measured. You stick one pole in the ground, you stretch the chain tight, you stick the other pole in, and you've got a first down. No, I mean a chain length. So that's what the surveyors were doing out here for months and for years, starting in Ohio and working farther west. And ultimately, the last piece of federal land surveyed by this system was not finished until the early 20th century. You got more than 100 years of surveying being done by the federal government. But it's extremely useful to people who want to own property, sell property, develop property, create infrastructure, all those things that are obviously parts of our story here. So eventually, you get surveyors here in Illinois. This is a map from about 1830. Can you see over here? About 1830. And you can see that the areas that have been surveyed are mostly down here in the southern part of Illinois and along the Mississippi River. And there's all this area out here, which is just crudely laid out, not surveyed yet, except for this, right? So what happened there? Well, those people, those investors, those speculators, those politicians who wanted to build a canal from Chicago got the federal government to jump them ahead of the queue in terms of surveying. So they got this area surveyed in advance of a lot of other parts of Illinois because, you know, they got things they want to do, busy people. And the result of that was this in local terms. Chicago, like everything else around here, pretty much, is laid out on that Jeffersonian grid pattern. And this is Chicago in 1830. This is a reconstructed map. And you can see there are these squares here. Those are each sections. Those are 1 mile on a side, 1 square mile. And you can see just barely, if you look in the front row, that every other section there is labeled canal land. So what the boosters of Chicago and Illinois got Congress to do was to let them have the proceeds from those alternate squares of land in order to build the canal. This is a system that I'm sure most of you know was later used to build the transcontinental railroads. Lots of railroads, but this is one of the earliest examples of it here in Chicago. And it's not a railroad; it's a canal. What it also did with this survey, in addition to producing a source of federal money for the canal, was to create the basis for downtown Chicago. This is south branch of the river, north branch of the river, main stem of the river. And you can see that in the beginning, it didn't just flow straight into Lake Michigan. It curved around through what's now Grant Park. This little channel that they cut through here was cut by the Army Corps of Engineers, but it's still, like I say, it ain't the Thames, right? But it was enough to get people interested in building that canal. And of course, there's dredging going on, and they're improving the waterway. And one of the things to keep in mind about this is that these sections here, as they did in rural areas, often created the roads. You run the roads along the edge of the sections. In downtown Chicago, it created the major streets, east, west, and north, south, for the rising city. So you got this here, and what are you going to do with it? There's no canal yet. There are people talking about it and trying to raise money. There's no obvious source of money, and out there, you still got all this flatland prairie with the tall grass that you can't farm. And then one of the other things that cities sometimes get founded to do is mining. There's no valuable minerals around here, as there were in Galena. So for a while in the early 19th century, Galena was much bigger than Chicago because it was a mining boom town. Lead's heavy. You dig out the lead, you ship it down the Mississippi on barges and so forth. And so remember that this is mouse as a pointer. I'm being asked to do. Doesn't seem to want to work with it. No.
Okay.
The laser is episodic here. But this is Chicago in 1832, and you got all this going on, the surveying of the squares and the laying out of lots and property and blah, blah. There's still no money for the canal, although there are people who want to start it. So what you do is you, through a whole series of pieces of legislation and political activity, you manage to get the state of Illinois and the federal government to keep coughing up little bits of money. And you also go after private investment. So, for example, this map on the right-hand side here, this is a watercolored map made in 1834 by a man who wanted to sell property. He and many others took maps like this to other places to try to get people to invest in Chicago. They went to New York, they went to Philadelphia, they went to Boston, they even went to London, and they took maps like this. And they also took big maps of the interior of the United States. And they would show this map, which shows a bustling little town with a busy river, and they would show the map of the United States and say, see, we're going to connect the end of Lake Michigan to the Mississippi River. Buy now, get in on the ground floor, buy your lot. And they were very good at this. So a lot of people began buying land sight unseen in Chicago. And then there were some people who bought land not sight unseen, most famously William Butler Ogden, who was sent as an agent by some wealthy New Yorkers to scout out land in the vicinity. And he wrote back to his employers that they had made a bad choice, that this is never going to amount to anything. But he stuck around for a while, and he realized what the buzz was about, sort of. So he started investing in land himself, and he became one of the major landowners in Chicago. He was the first mayor of Chicago. He's an investor in the canal. He's an investor in railroads of all sorts. He became a very rich man, and he helped to make the landscape of Chicago. So this is what they're selling, right? But they're doing it. They're very good at it. And they start building the canal. There are fits and starts. It stops because of the cholera pandemic in 1837. And then it starts up again, and they run out of money, and it starts up again. But eventually, in 1848, they open the canal. Finally, it's there. It's usable and very useful. And in the very same year, Mr. Ogden and some other people who were putting money into Chicago infrastructure also invested in Chicago's first railroad, the Galena and Chicago Union Railroad. Why Galena? Well, of course, it's the lead. Lead's heavy. You can float it on a barge. You can also load it on a train. And so what they were trying to do was to siphon off some of the lead from Galena, from what they call the driftless region out there in northwestern Illinois and southwestern Wisconsin, and bring it to Chicago instead of going down the Mississippi River. They created this railroad, and that was the first locomotive, the Pioneer, which, as I'm sure most of you know, is sitting down there in the Chicago History Center. If you haven't been down there lately, I strongly recommend it. They've made a lot of changes there, and it's always been a fun place to go, but it's even more fun place to go now. The route of the Galena and Chicago Union was laid out like this. In the initial round of construction, it didn't get anywhere near Galena, but it still made money because by this time, John Deere and some other people had invented steel-edged plows. And whereas you can't cut the prairie grass with a wooden plow, a steel-edged plow can do it, especially if you have a steel-edged plow pulled by oxen instead of horses, and especially by multiple oxen. So one of the little side things that happened here is that there was a business that started up of people going around with steel-edged plows and their oxen who didn't own any land, but who would for a fee plow your land for you. And once they had done it a couple times with the steel plow, you could use it with other implements. By the way, I have to get in a brief commercial here. The right of way here still exists in large measure. It's owned by the Union Pacific. And right about out here, just a little past Elgin, there is the Illinois Railway Museum. How many of you have been to the Illinois Railway Museum? Not nearly enough. Put it on your list of things to do. They have, it's the largest railway museum in the United States. They have 3, sometimes 4 working steam locomotives. You can ride on 19th century coaches and ride behind a steam locomotive on some track they owned out there. It's a lot of fun for kids of all ages, including me. Okay, now you get railroads, not just a canal. So what they're doing now is they've put the scheme to use for building a canal, but they're going further. And the state of Illinois wanted to build an enormous railroad system in the 1840s. This is what parts of this became the Illinois Central. And the idea, again, was to cut off Galena here and ship it down. You're just bypassing the Mississippi River here, basically. Took them a while to do anything like that. But you can see there's a investment speculative orientation here. And this is one of the reasons why Chicago managed to take off in a place where there shouldn't be a city, but where there were all these little bits of potential that people call boosters could put together and make use of it. Boosterism came in many forms. It wasn't just about transportation. There are people who made Chicago a major center of the grain trade, and not just of shipping grain, but of adapting the grain elevator. It wasn't invented here, it was invented in Buffalo, but the Middle West, especially Illinois, made a lot of use of grain elevators. I like this picture here because there's a really old grain elevator in it, and then there are all the modern storage containers there. Lumber. Some of you have probably read William Cronin's book, Nature's Metropolis. He talks about the way in which grain and lumber and other things made Chicago. And the railroad made the trade in those things possible. So now you've got things that are beginning to take off, right? You've got a momentum stepped up. The railroad also opened up suburbs, and there are savvy investors in the 1850s who start laying out suburbs. I picked the 2 most famous here. They're not the only ones, but Paul Cornell, who is the founder of Hyde Park, and Orrington Lunt, although he shared the title with some other people, and Evanston. I sometimes show this picture, or at least I used to before I retired, show this picture of Northwestern's campus. There's University Hall, right? And I taught in a room right there on University Hall. So I would be in the lecture hall and I'd show this picture and I'd say, you see those windows right there? Those are those windows right there. And they'd go, you know, as if they stepped through a time portal or something. But all kinds of things begin to pop up. And industry also begins to take advantage. Mr. McCormick, a bright young man from Virginia who had invented a reaper, realized that if he's going to make money, he has to be in the Middle West. So he went to Cincinnati, then the most important city in the Middle West. And he went to Milwaukee, and he went to St. Louis, and he came to Chicago. And William Butler Ogden, the investor, canal builder, first mayor of Chicago, said, Cyrus, got a deal for you. He said, you put your factory here in Chicago and I'll put up half the capital. And Cyrus said, what's not to like? And so he built this factory, and you can see how much of a gift it was from William Butler Ogden. There's Lake Michigan. This is looking southeast. There's the river, the main stem of the river. This is on the north bank of the Chicago River, about where the NBC building is now. And so he's got water access to the Great Lakes, down the river to the canal. If you're trying to sell things to the Middle Western farmer, that's terrific. And looky here, what do we got right out in front? That's the Galena Union Railroad. So it's a fantastic location. Burnt down in the fire, but that's neither here nor there. And the stockyards, a little later in time, but also a marvel of technology. So although none of these things were brand new exactly, Chicago entrepreneurs put them together in a way and on a scale that had not been done before. The Union stockyards stole things from Cincinnati. Means of slaughtering, means of transporting animal carcasses, means of turning them into this, that, and the other thing. All of that started in Cincinnati, including moving disassembly line for animals. But these guys brought it here on a scale that Cincinnati never saw. I'm mindful of the clock. You know, I told your hosts here that the problem with this is that professors wind up talking machines. And I thought I didn't have much to say, but it also turns out that for a variety of reasons, Chicago turned out to benefit from the construction of railroad networks, not just individual railroads. One of the most important reasons was that railroads coming from the east out here through northern Ohio and Michigan and whatnot often ended in Chicago. There was the end point of their terminals. And railroads going farther west often started in Chicago, and that means you have a transfer point. And if you got a transfer point, you can make money out of warehousing and shipping and so forth, moving one thing or the other. Chicago becomes, as it still is, this major hub of a spider web of railroads. A third of the freight traffic on railroads in the United States still goes through Chicago in some way or another. Not exactly this way, but in some way or another. You got a big city here. It's growing. It's got some drawbacks. Chicago's flat and it's low-lying. Another reason why there shouldn't be a city here. How many people here have had water in your basements? Chicago is, you can tell the whole history of Chicago in terms of water, basically. And one of the things that happened as the city got bigger and you got more and more people is that they're dumping their waste into the river. There's a primitive sewer system that also dumps waste into the river, and it all goes into the lake. And by the 1850s, they recognized that they're getting their drinking water out of the lake, and this is not a good idea. So they hired Ellis Chesborough, who is one of the top-notch civil engineers in the United States. He had built the Boston water system not long before this. And in the 1850s, he came out and said, in order to make this work, you got to raise the streets. So you can put sewers that have the right grade underneath. So, okay, they said. So they raised pretty much all of downtown Chicago, sometimes as much as 10, 12 feet, so they could put the sewers in underneath. This is a picture. Carl's going to be mad at me because he has a copy of this picture that's much brighter and better to see than I do. This is showing the sidewalk, which has been raised to the new grade while the street and the vehicles on it are still down at the old one. This is going on in the 1850s. And the other big event of this period was the extension of the water intake system. So the sewers are supposed to make the downtown drain better, so you don't have, puddles and all kinds of raw sewage here and there. What they did also, they decided that you could get purer water for drinking if you take it from farther out in the lake. So they built the first in the 1860s of this system of tunnels and cribs, as they're called, in which you build a structure out in the lake and drop a shaft and start cutting back this way, and a structure on land and drop a shaft and start cutting this way. And they hired miners from Pennsylvania to do this. But this is a little tricky. You're under the floor of the lake and you got people coming from two directions. What's to say that they're not gonna, go like that? But they did an extraordinary job of surveying underground so that when they actually finally did meet, they were only a few inches off at the junction. And this allowed them to bring water in to the shore from 2 miles out in the lake. And it got pumped and stored and distributed from this. This is the first piece of Chicago's system of waterworks. This is the pumping station, which still pumps today. This is what's commonly known as the water tower, which is basically a standpipe in which you pump water up in order to maintain pressure in the system. Now, of course, this being the Victorian era, you can't just put a blank-sided building up and put your standpipe in it. You got to have it look beautiful and decorated and so forth. And so that's what you got here. This is part of a whole system, a kind of sign of maturation in Chicago, in which you're not just building infrastructure, making money off of industry, building railroads, making money off of property, but you're also then beginning to say, hey, we got a kind of messy city here. We want to show it off. So they began thinking about beautification. Now, there's a lot more of this in the second half of the second lecture next week. But one of the things that first started in the 1860s was the planning for parks. Lincoln Park is an 1860s park. There was planning for other parks in the same period. And in addition to the public parks, the 1860s saw the construction of a number of cemeteries, Graceland being the most famous. Graceland is one of the earlier landscaped cemeteries in the United States, in which the idea is that it's not just a graveyard. It's not just a place where you bury people. It's also something that's attractive to living people. So this was at the end of the streetcar line on the north side. Working class people had one day off Sunday every week. So they often would bring their families out to the cemetery. You can get in for free and have a picnic. Whether or not they had anybody buried there, it was a pleasant place to be. And it's a nice example of the way of thinking that's ultimately going to go into much larger parks. Okay, getting close to the end here, folks. For today, at least. You know what happens. This is the O'Leary Family College on DeKoven Street on the southwest side. The O'Learys were Irish immigrants, like thousands of other people in Chicago. Mrs. O'Leary ran a dairy business, and they had a little barn out back where she kept cows. There wasn't just one cow, as some of the stories have. There are a number of cows, and she sells the milk to her neighbors. It's a small business. And somehow or other, a fire started in her barn. There are a lot of reasons why the fire spread so fast as it did. We are not entirely sure how it got started, but it's clear that it started in that barn. It raged for a long time. This is Chicago at the time of the fire. I ripped this off from Carl Smith. Full credit. Actually, Carl Smith, by the way, if you're interested in this, the best book ever written about the Great Chicago Fire is by Carl Smith. It came out for the anniversary a couple years ago. Chicago's Great Fire. Like that, Carl? He's supposed to be watching. Here's where it started. It jumped over the river, burned out most of the loop, jumped over the river again, burned all the way up to Fullerton Avenue, basically destroyed most of the city, downtown area of the city at that time. And it moved very fast. This is a map which shows the various currents and the places where it jumped. there's a lot more to say about this, but I'm not going to say that right now. Fire. One of the greatest fires in American history, urban fires in American history. It is, some say, one of the very first media events, because there was journalism reporting on it while it was still burning. The same thing happened with some battles in the Civil War, but in non-wartime, this is one of the first of those things where you can't watch your television, but you could read your newspaper and you can read extras in the newspaper, and that's one of the things that happened. And there's also a huge industry in producing vivid images of the fire. Not a lot of photographs of the fire, millions of photographs of what happened afterward, but not nearly any in the right place at the right time, mainly because the photographers, like everybody else, were fleeing for their lives. So we don't actually have pictures, photographic pictures. So that opened up the way for a cottage industry of images. And I have to conclude, although I'll say more about the aftermath of the fire later on. We have to spread the word that the cow was innocent. Their diligent work by historians has shown that the person who started the story about the cow was not in the O'Leary barn at the time the fire started, but he had been there himself a few minutes earlier. So it's quite likely that he started the fire and blamed it on the poor cow, who was not around to defend herself in the aftermath. But more recently, the Chicago City Council, recognizing the injustice that had been done, has officially exonerated Mrs. O'Leary's cow. All right, that's all I have to say for this evening. How are we doing on question time?
Questions from the Zoom audience that numbers 80. So there are a lot of people out there.
Hi, Zoomers.
And let me give you a couple of questions first from Zoom. First of all, there was great indignation about Mrs. O'Leary's cow before you announced the exoneration. So you can see what people are actually really interested in. One question came in from our Northwestern colleague, Wes Scogan, who asks, why Chicago rather than Milwaukee? Why here?
That's a good question. And there were other places that thought they could be what Chicago became. Milwaukee could have been something similar, but it would have required a huge investment in infrastructure to make that connection to the Mississippi River. Although it was feeble, the link that the indigenous people already knew about down the south branch of the Chicago River, across the portage, down the Des Plaines River, that was already there. People were using it and so forth. And people used portages across Wisconsin, but they're longer and more arduous. And so the money concentrated here.
Next question from the Zoom audience. Shirley says, so they really still use the old water tower pumping station at Michigan Avenue? It appears to be inactive. Not just the water filtration plant?
The water filtration plant serves, along with a couple of other plants, actually serves the vast bulk of Chicago. But that pumping station is still in operation, and I don't know how the connections work, but it's there. The crib that I showed you, the first crib built out there in the lake, is not in operation anymore. Nowadays, there's a whole, which way am I looking here? A whole host of cribs out there along the shore of Chicago with their own under lake conduits.
Some of the cribs would serve well as guano harvesting points. You can see that from afar. Their Wilson Avenue crib is basically white.
Yeah, yeah.
So how were the buildings raised? I heard that they used screws, but didn't these buildings have basements?
Screws is right. Among the many things I pruned out of this lecture when I realized time was not available, was an image of one of the raising of one of the buildings downtown. George Pullman, by the way, before he made railway cars, made a lot of money when he came to Chicago by raising buildings to match the new grade. And the way he and others did it was to excavate underneath the foundations and install a whole forest of screw jacks, hundreds of them underneath the structure, and an army of people underneath the building to turn the screw jacks. And there were guys with megaphones who would yell out, and each worker would pull 1/4 turn on the screw jack. And they got so good at this that they could raise the buildings very slowly, but they could raise them quite a ways. The famous illustration that I was going to show you is of a hotel in the Loop, which they raised without interrupting business. So there are people coming and going and eating and sleeping, and the building's going.
If we have any questions from the room, I will walk around. Make sure you do wait for the microphone, please.
I had heard that when we were building the canal, I think it's St. Louis sued us to stop.
Sorry, I can't quite understand you.
So no, it's a glitch. So go ahead. I will.
So I had heard that St. Louis had sued us when we were building the canal to try and stop it. And so it wound up kind of becoming like a race to not like finish it basically before a court decision came through. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate on any of that.
Yeah, the question is about whether St. Louis sued us over the canal. And they did sue us, but not over that first canal in 1848. It was over it's the massive rebuilding of the canal that's there now, in part because that coincided with various reforms in disposal of waste. And what was happening in part was that we were shipping our waste downstream to St. Louis. And they didn't like that, and they sued us. They're really active, interesting period there where cities around the nation, not just this one, are figuring out how to treat waste, what chemicals they can use, what they can do. You can tell what kind of a nerd I am, that I spent part of an afternoon last week watching a video tour of the Metropolitan Water and Sanitation District tunnels underneath the city. Carl Smith, if he's still there, he was doing the same thing. That whole system of canals and the what's called the deep tunnel, the tunnel in the reservoir project, which is not yet completed after years of work. The whole point of that is to be able to store stormwater and to maintain it in a way that doesn't overflow the whole system at low levels. We have what's called a combined sewer system, which means that water from your sink and water from your toilet go into the same sewer. More modern cities have sometimes separated those. So the water filtration plants both treat incoming water and wastewater. There's a wonderful one over there at Howard Street and the McCormick Boulevard, and every so often they open it up for tours. You can put a clip on your nose, but it's a really interesting place to go.
I'll pass it around to Professor Pinto. There you go. If you could still try and project your voice, that would be great.
I was wondering if canal traffic is still viable in Chicago. Are we a transfer point for water traffic?
Very much so. Is canal traffic still viable in Chicago? But it's not the original canal. The 1848 canal doesn't exist anymore within the city of Chicago. The expressway runs along a lot of the route along the south branch of the river where the canal was. But there's a brand new canal, bigger, deeper, more efficient, which is heavily trafficked. There is a story, which I hope is true, but I'm not entirely sure. Some years ago, it was while I was here, but this seems so unbelievable, I didn't quite credit it. Some years ago, Northwestern decided they were going to replace all the doors in one of the dormitories. And they were going to do this over winter break when the students weren't here. So they diligently, winter break came, students went home, they took out all the doors in the dormitory, and they had new doors coming. But hundreds of doors are pretty heavy, and they were being shipped on a barge on the canal from central Illinois. Cold snap came, froze the canal solid. Barge with doors stuck down there somewhere on the southwest side. Students come back after Christmas break and say, What the, no doors on their rooms.
We have time for a number of other questions.
Okay, hi. I was gonna remind you, which I'm sure you know about, the series How We Got to Now, the first chapter of Steve Johnson. He covers water, and he's using the city of Chicago and its plumbing and sewage system as an example of innovation and at the forefront of urban water development, whatever, triaging. My question is, you don't mention the people that were digging the canals, and you don't mention the connection between the people that are digging the canals and the grim labor that was involved, you know, the lives lost, I think, and
Oh, yeah, lots of
immigrants
them, yeah.
expiring. I mean, the money made and the planning, but the actual numbers of everyday people and the suffering, I don't mean to be grim, but I think that's a key part of that story.
Grimness is an important way to look at it, I think. And it's not just our canal, it was canals in general. That whole web of canals that I showed you on that map, the northeastern United States, all those were dug by hand. They don't have steam excavators until the 1850s. So you've got a bunch of guys with strong backs, shovels, and carts pulled by donkeys who have to move all that earth. Nowadays, you come in there with a John Deere machine and do it in a day, but it was grim work. They were hired on contract by middlemen who would exploit them. They lived in tent cities. One of the reasons why the canal took a long time to get done was that there was a cholera epidemic in 1836, and the death toll amongst the canal workers was horrendous. Yeah, that's all part of it.
Question. I shouldn't depend on my own memory, but somebody
I've been there.
somebody told me that and we're new to Chicago, so that's that the canals, at one point, canals, the water flow was out into the lake, and the canals brought it the other direction. Is that correct?
Yes. And when I talked about the guy from Boston, the civil engineer who came out and proposed raising the grade and so forth, one of the things that he and some others talked about way back in the middle of the 19th century was trying to reverse the flow of the Chicago River, so it didn't flow into the lake, but rather flowed backwards. So there were efforts to do that, but it did not succeed until the beginning of the 20th century when they dug the new canal, the wider canal. And that's one reason why St. Louis sued us, because they had finally tipped the thing back the other way and put locks in at the mouth of the Chicago River, so it allegedly can't go that way. But as all of you know, if we have a torrential rain, they have to open those gates and you can't go to the beach.
The issue that I recall was that the debris was coming, garbage and trash was coming out into Lake Michigan. And they wanted to reverse that. So they take water out of the lake and move it inland. Is that fairly correct?
Yes, it is. And it's not just debris, it's raw sewage that
Uh-huh.
was going into the lake.
Okay, thank you.
We have a number of questions from Zoom again.
So we're still not done with Mrs. O'Leary. Okay, the cow has been exonerated, but are we sure that the fire still started in that barn?
Yes, we are.
And what is the evidence?
I don't know, but you'll have to ask Carl Smith. He
Okay.
wrote the book.
Right.
I mean, there's evidence at the time when the Chicago Fire Department was trying to respond. There had been another big fire on the west side just before. The fire department was exhausted. They had lost some of their equipment in the previous fire. So they were not able to respond in an effective way, but they knew where the fire started.
Next question. Why are canals so important? Could you explain briefly what makes a canal so important?
You can carry very heavy loads on barges on water much more efficiently than you can on rail or by road in a truck. I heard the other day that one of those barges that they use on the canal now to carry grain and fuel and other kinds of things can carry as much as 30 tractor trailers. And it's all on that one barge. And of course, if you have many dozens of barges, then you can move a whole lot of things. And moving it over water is slow, but it's not very expensive.
One more question from Zoom. So what is or what was holding up city streets? Can you find the ground?
You mean when they raised the streets?
Right.
Yeah. Well, they filled in enough to raise the grade of the streets to the new level. But there are still a lot of places in Chicago where the buildings were never raised. You know, I mean, the big important business buildings in the loop, they could afford to hire George Pullman to raise their structure. But people's houses, if you go down to Pilsen or other parts of the South Side that weren't burned in the fire, you'll often find houses where you have to walk downstairs to get to the front door. And that's because the streets were raised, but the house wasn't.
I read Carl Smith's book about the fire for a discussion group that's going to happen on Saturday, and I gave you a sheet of comments and questions related to that book. Could you take a look and see if any of the questions might be useful for this discussion here?
I'll take a quick look. No, these are all about things that happened later on than where I am right now, and also not so much in my area of expertise, but they may be in Carl's.
It's not working. Oh, okay. My question is in regards when the Indian boundary was established, were the indigenous people promised something to, like, I guess, quote unquote, give up that area or that land? Were they promised like a profit from there, or that they would get like some type of monetary? How did that?
This is part of a huge, long, sad story in which there's treaty after treaty after treaty after treaty in which the indigenous people give up chunks of land, often big chunks of land, often in return for very minor compensation at all in one lump sum at the beginning. And it's not necessarily money. It might be tools, it might be guns, it might be other kinds of things. I frankly don't know how there was compensation for that easement, but that's what happened. But I mean, the bottom line is that almost always the indigenous people got screwed.
Hi, I live in Rogers Park, and across the street from my house is a school, and I live close enough to the lake that when I dig down a few inches, I hit sand. So what I'm wondering is, obviously there would be lots of sand downtown. How did they figure out, you know, when they were getting ready to build the school across from me, there were these huge hammers or whatever that just compacted the sand. Now, could you tell me, do you have any idea about how the streets were constructed?
Well, that's actually two questions, them really interesting.
Thank you.
One of them has to do with why there's so much sand in the first place around the Chicago area, and that's because Lake Michigan has not always been where it is now. If you go back through thousands of years, especially back to the glacial period. The glaciers that created Lake Michigan came and went and came and went and came. And so there are a lot of different versions of Lake Michigan in the past, some of them with shorelines far inland from where we are now. And one of the remnants of that, and one of the things that indigenous people made use of, is that I talked about Chicago as flat, but it's not entirely flat. There are ridges. Chicago Avenue, Clark Street is on a ridge. Ridge Avenue in Evanston is on a ridge. There are a couple more out in Skokie. And those were all created by the glaciers as they came and went and whatnot. There are also a lot of other kind of land features created by the glaciers that, make that. But one of the consequences was that there were all those former beaches, which is where the sand is. And if you dig down almost anywhere within a mile of the lake, you're going to find sand eventually. The machines you were talking about, by the way, I know this only because they were using one of them in my neighborhood and it nearly shook my house down. They have they're pile driving machines, but in the old days, if you want to drive a steel piling down into the earth, you have something that's like a big hammer that's banging on it. Nowadays, they have these very powerful machines that grab it at the top. It's a sheet of metal nowadays. Grab it at the top and shake it. And they shake it vigorously enough while pushing down on it that it works its way down. Meanwhile, they're shaking the whole neighborhood, but it's very efficient from their point of view.
We have time for 2 or 3 more questions. Anyone? Yes.
It's all water under the bridge now, but the Native Americans of Chicago were done out of the city for 3 cents an acre at the time, paid in silver half dollars, out of which they were done out of which by white swindlers in no time flat. So they ended up going to Iowa with next to nothing. The other one, the most plausible explanation I've heard of the O'Leary case is that one of the neighbors of the O'Leary, since it was a small business, it snuck into the barn to get a hold of some milk for nothing, and it milked the cow too vigorously, which upset the cow, which caused it to knock the lantern over. We'll never know for sure, but it certainly makes sense. Why did Chicago burn down? Because somebody wanted a ripoff.
Well, let me say that there's scads of explanations for the fire, and nobody really knows exactly what happened. But there are some pretty exotic ones that are interesting. Most of you probably know that on the same night when the Chicago fire started, there was a wildfire in Wisconsin, the Peshtigo fire, which was much bigger and killed far more people than the one that happened here, but it got no news coverage. And people have discovered that there were a number of other fires that started on the same night, all around the Midwest, some in Michigan. So there's this one theory that it was part of a meteor impact that broke up in the atmosphere and hit a lot of different places. I don't know. Marty.
Well, first of all, thank you. It was great. I just thought maybe you would encourage folks who are here who might not otherwise know that not only you and Carl and I have watched that video, but that you can go to the water reclamation site and watch it on their site, and it tells you all about this. The history it's quite good. Did you not think it was good?
Yeah. What?
And it goes from the beginning to contemporary right now time, and you can see about the deep tunnel and all that went before it. And they're very it's well presented. They have fabulous photographs taken way back in the early part of the construction that are spectacularly clear. So anyway, you can just go online, Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, and you can get it. So watch it.
By the way, I should mention that I feel like I'm Carl Smith's agent tonight. Carl Smith also wrote one of the best books about urban water supply, not about sewage and waste disposal and so forth. It's called City Water, City Life, and it's about the early creation of public water systems in Philadelphia and Chicago and Boston, and all the stuff that went along with that. You know, if you're piping water into people's houses, how do you meter it? All these kinds of little problems that I hadn't thought about before, but they're big ones at the time.
Going back to Zoom, do you have favorite books on Chicago history? I would love a bibliography at the end of the second session to continue learning. Thank you.
I will try to remember to do that, especially if you will email me and tell me and remind me of that question.
I will-
Yeah, I have a lot of favorite books, but I'll try to keep the number down to something.
Then
manageable.
there's an announcement of, and this is coming from the official side from Evanston Public Library. Make sure you mention, Jeff, the Chicago River Program, Thursday, November 16th from 6:15 to 7:30. The title is Chicago's Rivers, a Vital Part of Our Past, Present, and Future. Learn about the history of the Chicago-Calumet River System and what is happening to preserve and protect this vital network. So once again, Thursday, November 16th from 6:15 to 7:30 here in the library.
Good to know.
Okay, I'm going to email this information to everyone, and it will be during the next week.
Better for the people at home for this microphone, so thank you for
There's a gentleman in the back who has a question.
sorry about that.
One experience of seeing an earthquake up in Chicago. One day, yeah, I'm sure you can hear me because I can be very loud. One day I had an experience where I woke up in the morning on Sunday and a cloud was over my head, as it were, soon as I opened my eyes. And I was troubled about it and I ignored it. I said, oh, it'll go away once I go to church service. Well, it didn't go away. Continued to stay over my head through the worship. And, you know, about 3 o'clock when I was walking a certain way, it was getting dark, just like it was over my head, getting physically dark, and it was going to rain. And when I got about more than halfway down the block to go to the next street, all of a sudden I felt the earth shake under me, but this was not real. And I tried to catch myself from falling, and I saw people going on Ashland, 86 and Ashland, running, you know, back and forth, you know, almost hitting each other, panicking. And I came back to myself and I said, what in the world was that? Is that going to happen for real, Lord? And that ain't the first time something I had a dream later on. So is Chicago anywhere near a fault? Which I think I already know that because I had to do some research.
My wife and I have conversations about this because I persuaded her to get earthquake insurance. It's cheap, you know, it's about much money, but that's because of a fault. Yes, indeed, there was a major fault that is down in southern Illinois and stretches across the Mississippi Valley down there, and that fault is responsible for the largest earthquake ever recorded in this part of North America. Back in 1814, I think it was, and it's way down there in southern Illinois, but it shook things up here. And at that point, there weren't many people here, and there were reports that it made church bells ring hundreds of miles away. There weren't many people here, and there's no Richter scale in those days, so we don't know exactly precisely what it was like.
I think I could shed a little bit more light on the earthquake vulnerability in Chicago. While the fault is way down there by New Madrid, the Reelfoot fault system, the reason we do sometimes feel earthquakes in Chicago is because the bedrock is so solid, there's not a lot of fracturing, so the waves travel very far. It's not like in California.
So on that optimistic note, let's all give Professor Henry Binford a round of applause.
Thank you.
And we look forward to hearing the rest of the story. Who used to say that?
Oh, you're
Okay, that's back. to the
dating yourself
60s.
and me.
Yeah. We'll look forward to hearing the rest of the story next week. Same time, same station. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you for those on Zoom for attending as well. Good night, everyone.
Thank you for the questions. A lot of fun.